Hi, Arjun. Thanks for coming back.
Hello, how's things, Mike? It's always good to catch up.
Yeah, man, things are good. I mean, everybody was hoping for a Christmas rally and now, or Santa rally. Now it looks like we're more in the Christmas massacre side of things. What's
Mhm.
your view? What are you seeing out there?
I think we've still got some rallying to go. The general outlook about at least the US economy, tech stocks that you and I are interested in, I think it's quite positive still. Those underlying tech tailwinds are still there. There's a lot of innovations that's still ongoing, and those are what drive a lot of those outlooks. I think, there was a little scare with Feds cutting rates. I think there was a little scare with the Chinese economy continuing to get worse over time, and that's particularly, important for Australians because they're a huge market for our exports. So I think it's going to be tech and companies still affected by these new regulatory changes still have a positive outlook, but there's a lot of stuff outside of that that maybe does not have such a positive outlook. And I think in Australia particularly, it's not looking as green on the other side of 2025.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it seems like there was a huge swing after Trump's election in certain
Mm-hmm.
parts of the market, big rally. Small caps have now retraced that whole thing. But
Yeah,
most of the small cap tech and growth and Bitcoin, most of that sold off in a few days, but it's still way up
yeah,
from
yeah.
then. So
Still
it
so
seems like
bright. Bitcoin's.
there was a mad rush into that part of the market, and now it's probably unwinding to some extent. But there was interesting. It was interesting that there was a. It was interesting that like there's a measure that we look, which is the number of stocks trading below their 20-day, and that's now hit extremely kind of stretched levels, which usually have marked lows. So I think in the short term, hopefully the pain is over. I did notice that inflation measures have started rising again in the United States. So I track Truflation, which is a basket of actual prices that is updated daily. So it's like live prices, and that's up to
Yeah,
3% now. And that had come all the way back down, and that was leading. That's kind of like a few months ahead of the kind of Fed's published indexes, price indexes. So there's definitely been inflation, and the idea that people are just going to crush rates when everything's still red hot, is probably not going to happen the way everybody hopes.
yeah. The question that a lot of people have is like, do rates continue to come down in 2025 or stay the same? Do you have a view on that? I mean, looking at this truthflation thing, it looks like inflation's almost doubled in the last like 3 months since mid-September.
Mm.
So, that would tell me that, maybe rates are going to stay the same or even potentially increase by a little bit. But, the consensus view would be that we're done with rate raises and now we're going to go into like a period of rate cuts. What's your take on that?
Look, I think it's hard. I think, like, for example, in Australia, inflation never really came down below 3%. And you've still got this huge cost of living crisis. And sure, house prices have started to fall, but rents are still high. It's still pretty red hot out there. So it's hard to see why they would cut rates with inflation higher. If anything, they didn't do enough. They were too cautious in Australia anyway. The United States obviously went harder and they did get it below 2%, but now it's rising again. So they're just going to have to follow it. I think the Trump economy is going to be red hot. I think
Yeah,
he's going to run things hard and fast. And so it's going to be a good opportunity to make money if you're in the right spot and if you're in the right companies as an investor. But it's going to be hot, if that makes sense. There's going to be investment, there's going to be action. It's open for business. The interesting thing, the wild card in the United States is, do they cut government spending? Because that's extremely inflationary. Like, if you're wondering around who on earth is affording all these house prices, often it's like NDIS contractors, or government employees on several hundred thousand a year. And all those kind of payrolls have just massively expanded. All the job growth in Australia has been NDIS, healthcare, government related. So if you pull back on that spending, then you'll probably get some relief on inflation. But while they're doing that, then the people in the private sector who are actually paying tax rather than kind of like working for the government, receiving it, um, in a lot of, we have to carry the whole load basically and suffer the consequence of high inflation driven by all that government spending as well. It's tough. I mean, the US has had a change of government, so there's a good chance that there will be a bunch of civil servants looking for work. It's a good chance like wasteful spending will be cut. That will probably take the edge off, the very pro-business kind of gung-ho feel in the United States at the moment. In Australia, we don't really have that, right? In Australia, the NDIS is still accelerating. Immigration's still way above, Labor's own forecasts, which were way above, historic averages. You're still seeing construction companies go under. It still doesn't look great here. And it's no surprise that the Aussie dollar, for example, has collapsed. Australians are just becoming poorer and poorer. There was a moment not so long ago where we were wealthy and we could travel the world and it was great. Now you go to New York and you can feel it.
yeah. I think it's almost 1.6 to US dollar right now, which is just crazy. I mean, it's
Mm.
such large moves in an exchange rate in such a short period of time, they harm us for sure. Yeah, you mentioned the NDIS there. I think maybe that's a good segue for us to talk about that. We wanted to cover, like you mentioned, NDIS is a huge part of Australian government spending. It affects healthcare, which obviously I'm quite interested in. You are as well. And it's actually to kind of play the other side for a moment there. I think people have recognized, especially in the government, people have recognized that the NDIS is growing, and there's been, pretty serious efforts now to try and curb it back a little bit. What's your take on these efforts, how they'll play out? I was just reading about it now, and I think that they're trying to bring the growth rate back down to 8%. So moderate growth of the NDIS budget of 8% a year, which is in my head still really high, but they're trying to pull it back. I think it's growing at like 10 or something like that right now, which is obviously unsustainable. But it'd be good to get your take on NDIS changes that are going to be playing out over the next 5 years.
Remember, this is a Labor project. There's like very senior Labor figures involved in it. It's not fit for purpose. They're literally unable to do it because the only way you can do it is to take out autism and learning disabilities. These are often very tested very subjectively. And if you get on it, then you get like huge lump payments. You then get everything from care to like people helping you with your daily errands to, all kinds of like benefits potentially throughout your life, depending how the system goes. And there's no way to reform this in any meaningful way by taking a small measure. Like whether it grows at 10 or 8% is not relevant. And already they're proving they can't do that, right? They can't even bring it back down from 10%. It's kind of like immigration. They say they want to bring it back and it actually ends up accelerating. It's the key decision makers are behind this entire policy. They can't admit on that side of government anyway that the mistakes that were made, and they can't correct those mistakes because they'll kind of undo their life's work. Like that's their political reputation depends on them making the right calls, and they just can't admit that the failure that it's really been. But the real issue is you've got this situation where there's fewer and fewer taxpayers paying more and more, and that's going to be the biggest expenditure probably that this country ever does in dollar values. It's probably, I can't remember if it's exceeding Medicare yet already, but it's vastly outstripping other government programs, and it's kind of happened by accident. It was never supposed to be like this. This was supposed to be like, you get caught in a car accident, you're paralyzed for life, and you need lifetime care. There's almost every Australian would support that. Almost every Australian's happy paying higher taxes to make sure, people like that have lifetime care they need. But the way this has worked, where somebody who's classified with learning disabilities then gets their landscaping done, can then like get special accommodation, that can then have like somebody take them to the shops and the cinema, and have like a sex worker to make them feel better. I think that should be done on your own dime. It's not, nobody signed up for this, and it's been an absolute disaster. And there's always like this impression that the money comes from somewhere. It comes from people that pay it. And so it's not free money. But you do get this sense that that's barely a consideration. I'm not sure. What do you think? Is there a solution here? Do you think it just needs to be reformed from scratch?
I'll take the hopeful side of this. I think you're right. The NDIS is very way out of control. There's a lot of fraud and abuse on it right now. Looking at the kind of reforms that they want to put in, so they're targeting intra-plan inflation. So one of the things that you mentioned is, once someone gets on the NDIS, their plan just kind of grows and grows and grows. And a lot of the times they're actually encouraged to spend their budget as quickly as possible so that it tops up and they get the same amount of money again. So they're trying to go after a couple of these things at the moment, which I think is good. And then they're also going after a lot of like services that just really shouldn't be a part of the NDIS. And I hope things like landscaping and stuff are on that list. Whether that brings it down meaningfully or if these are just around the edges, we're about to find out. I want to take the hopeful side. I mean, I think, in general, like you mentioned, the NDIS is something that lots of Australians, kind of are a fan of. It's just like the scale and what's on there that people are less, less happy about. So hopefully some of these changes will bring something interesting. I think there's like a lot of interesting startups actually working in this area to try and help streamline this process and, kind of aid people in getting better audits of their NDIS programs and things like that. Yeah, we'll see. I think it's a good thing that they're at least looking at it. I mean, it's so hard to ignore the rate at which it's growing and the size that it already is. I think it's already greater than the entire West Australian healthcare budget. So all West Australians get all their healthcare for less than the NDIS, but obviously that's a national program. But
actually this is where it comes from, the way the entire government approach to these kinds of things. So they set like an hourly rate and rates that they'll pay, and then everybody's incentivized then to maximize that. The person gets the service, the service provider isn't charging them. There's no person getting the service isn't paying it out of their pocket. They're actually incentivized, as you say, to use it or they lose it, that's a common problem in a lot of government stuff, right? Like every government department, if you don't spend it, you generally lose it. You have to justify your spending each year. But it's just ballooned. It's almost the size of defense spending. It's going to our country and has already materially weakened it, because this is all financial capacity that could be used in more productive areas, and the vast bulk of it isn't. And basically, this is going to materially weaken our country. Like this is money that's not going in the right spot. And I think there's also a societal issue we have with mental health. So obviously mental health is a big thing, and this is like I've got like a different take what most people have on this. Mental health is a big thing. We're all going through very difficult times at various periods in our life, and we should all help each other wherever we can.
I want to ask you one. So, I saw you made some posts and you put a podcast out with the Syntara. What have you been working on? Tell me a little bit about it. It's which is a really hot and interesting area at the moment. What's your take?
Yeah, definitely. Well, this is quite a bit of a random company in the sense that I don't think anyone really has been following it. Certainly, when I speak to fund managers, until now, nobody had heard of it. They basically became specialists in antifibrotics. So it's a team of chemists. They do all their own research, develop their own small molecule drugs, and they specialize in inhibiting a very particular enzyme that's there in scar formation, which like cross-links collagen. And turns out the scarring process that happens in your skin is the same in myelofibrosis, which is in your bone marrow. It's the same in your lungs, same in your heart when you have heart attacks, there's scarring afterwards. It kind of pops up everywhere. And this is the second phase 2. The first phase 2 showed that there was some effect, but this was the big one that was really this was designed with the right amount of drug to actually see something if there was something there. And it was a huge success. 80% of people who responded. And to respond, you have to have your symptom score drop by 50%. And this is there's no cure. There's nothing that extends life at the moment in myelofibrosis. You basically take these JAK inhibitors, which basically as your bone marrow scars, it can't generate blood cells. So your liver and your spleen start doing it, and then they get swollen and inflamed, and that causes symptoms. So when that gets too bad, then they'll put you on JAK inhibitors, but they try and avoid even doing that because they have very difficult side effects. And then there's a delicate dance where as people get sicker and sicker, they have to lower the dose until right at the end, they have to take you off JAK inhibitors, and there's really nothing left. So to have something that's disease modifying that actually helps with the scarring that causes the disease and also has such a vivid effect in these 16 patients is groundbreaking. And it's a red hot space in transactions as well. So you're talking about like 3 billion Aussie plus for phase 3. And then there was a transaction last week that was probably about 1 billion Aussie. Or sorry, it was a few weeks ago, early in December. And it was 300 million Aussie up front for data at the same stage as Syntara, but it would just help with one symptom. It wasn't disease modifying. So Syntara's data in this trial was way ahead of the market. So it's pretty exciting because it's a $100 million market cap. They probably need 50 to 100 mil Aussie, maybe 50 mil US to do phase 3. Phase 3 is a big unlock if they choose to do it themselves, if they raise the money here, because then you get that $2, $3, $4 billion outcome for a 50 to 100 million dollar spend. It could be a phenomenal return. But there's also a chance they partner, and there's still the final readout in like March next year, and then discussions with the FDA probably mid next year to design the phase 3, and there are 2 more key moments. But this is a $20 million market cap, like not that long ago. This is a tiny company. Nobody had heard of it. It was just one of many companies with a hopeful drug, and now it's got something which could be the market leading standard of care for those patients. In a multi-billion-dollar market. So it's super exciting. So it's probably my number 1 pick at the moment, not just because of the opportunity, but also because it's because the market cap is so low. It's a $100 million company.
So these companies naturally lend themselves to a platform approach. If you have a target that works in one tissue, it makes sense in a lot of ways to try and go use it in another tissue as well. And these diseases are woefully treated. So, they're really bad. There's just not enough or not as many treatment options for patients that have these diseases. So it's often, the lifestyle changes, avoidance of triggers. The context that I'm thinking of is lung fibrosis, which is really common. Often you get it from environmental exposure and things like that. So, a lot of the treatment is just trying to avoid those things, and see your doctor as often as you can, let them know if you get an infection and stuff like that. So I think it's a really interesting area, fibrotic diseases in general. A lot of these fibrotic diseases are untapped markets where they're really bad medication, or not really bad, just so few options available to patients that get these diseases. Often the medications have a lot of side effects and are quite toxic. So I think it's a super interesting area. And like you said, I think a lot of pharma are taking notice as well. Post-immune oncology, like where do you go next? I think metabolic is one answer, and then fibrotic disease is another compelling answer as well. So I don't know too much about Syntara, but I'm really keen to look deeper into the fibrotic disease.
Yeah, it's worth a look
fibrotic disease
because
area.
also they have multiple programs. They've got two studies in MDS. So MDS is maybe 3 times as big, but it's kind of like blood cancer. They've got a Parkinson's disease, or rather a sleep disorder that leads to Parkinson's, again funded by somebody else, non-dilutively. And then they're actually doing a program in scars. So they have data that shows that the collagen in scars is reduced by 30%. And these are old scars as well, not in like new scars. So if they can prove that, that's a cosmetic product. That's a whole different line again. And again, to see these, like, a company with like 4 programs in the clinic that was trading for 20, 30, 40 million bucks and actually develop the drugs in-house. Like on the ASX, you're constantly getting pitched reformulated drugs, repurposed drugs, drugs off patent, drugs that obviously when pharmaceutical companies often decide not to pursue a program, they'll just give it away for next to nothing, or let their rights lapse and let the drug return to whoever sold it to them. And then a lot of people build companies on these in the ASX and like promise the world and raise a lot of money. And you can make a lot of money if you're earning a salary and all that kind of stuff. You can get very wealthy just by raising a lot of money on the back of a poor quality asset. This isn't one of those situations. This is like they have their own lab, they're doing their own work, and I feel like the successes have been like that. Like Clarity this year, again, it was like a science company that did their own work and they're working on something new. I really feel like the Cochlea, another Australian example, like the companies that are doing real science and something new are just so much more interesting than the ones that are just repurposing something. Yeah, that's kind of my take on that.
Totally. And then, this kind of spawned another interest in my head. So I don't know if you saw there was a recent readout from Tessera. It's preclinical, so it's nothing crazy. But there's a company called Tessera that basically started validating an approach where you basically use a CAR T mode to treat autoimmune diseases. So for people who are less familiar with CAR Ts are a cell therapy where basically someone has a cancer and their T cells are not attacking the cancer in a normal or physiologic way. You take the T cells out of the patient, you modify them to make them targeted towards that cancer. You grow them, you kind of help them out a little bit. That process can take like 4 to 6 weeks. And then I put those T cells back into the patient, and now they have this cancer targeting receptor on them, and they go off and try and find the cancer. And this has been a really revolutionary treatment modality for liquid tumors or blood cancers. So things like the ones that you were talking about, myelodysplastic syndrome, multiple myeloma, and lymphoma. And one of the issues with using this mode in solid tumors, so things like colorectal cancer or breast cancer or prostate cancer, the cancers that most people are familiar with, is that these edited T cells, they are kind of not allowed into the tumor. The tumor has its own microenvironment that suppresses the activity of these kind of cancer-killing T cells. And so that's limited a lot of the use in this. And so now another interesting approach, instead of going at solid tumors, is actually to look at other diseases that you can use this T cell approach for. And there's been a lot of interest in applying these to autoimmune diseases, things like rheumatoid arthritis, which a lot of people have, or lupus, which a lot of people have. And treatments for these diseases are pretty good, super high quality treatments for people with severe disease. And so what Tessera showed is that they can actually skip. So one, they can apply this T cell approach to autoimmune diseases. That's pretty big. People have done something like that, but that's pretty big. And I think that's a trend that's emerging and is going to grow and continue.
Hey, Arjun, can you just explain how does it help with autoimmune diseases exactly? So it's clear how it works in a cancer environment, but
Great question. So because I can edit these T cells with whatever receptor targeting thing that I want, I can actually target them to cancer cells in the cancer context, or I can target them at immune cells that are hyperactive in autoimmune disease. So what people do or what Tessera did in lupus is they basically realized that B cells, which is another kind of immune cell, secrete a lot of these antibodies that increase the patient's inflammatory state in a very high level. And what they did is they targeted their T cells to kill some of those B cells. So the overall antibody level went, the overall inflammatory level, if you want, went down, improving their symptoms. But the key thing is that they actually did this without removing the T cells from the patient at all. like I said, that's not a patient at all. It's a mouse that they did it in. But they showed that they can edit the T cells inside the mouse itself. So they wrap a receptor-like targeting thing in a particle of whatever type. There's several different candidates for what kind of particle you'd use, and you just directly inject that into the mouse. It seeks out the T cells, puts the receptor on them, and then those T cells expand and go and kill those B cells. So it's a really fine-grained iteration of original cell therapies, and we're applying it to new areas. So I think there's these two confluent technologies that are emerging right now. One is cell therapy is being applied to autoimmune medicine or autoimmune disease. And the second one is going from an ex vivo approach where I do the editing outside of your body. It takes time, expensive, delays treatment. And now doing that inside a patient makes it faster. I can get a much higher transfection rate of T cells, and I can give you the drug straight away. If I know you have the disease and you need the drug, I can give it to you today rather than having to wait and do this expensive process. I think both of these trends are going to continue to grow, continue to emerge. There's a lot of interesting companies that have raised tons of money in the US and abroad, and even some in Australia that are starting to do this. But I think it's an area to watch if you're interested in biotech. And it's a really hopeful thing for patients. I mean, a lot of these cell therapies have been just sequestered in hematological or blood cancers. And now we're starting to see that emerge into solid tumors a little bit, but more importantly into these broader autoimmune diseases that I think, cause a significant amount of morbidity worldwide. So I think it's a really interesting trend.
That ex vivo point is an interesting one because there's been a number of those that have been approved that have been commercial disasters. So there was a company, Bluebird Bio, that got 2 approved that is basically continually running out of money. Even like CRISPR hasn't really been a commercial success. And, in myelofibrosis that we're talking about, there is actually a cure, can be a cure for that in the same way. But you have to basically wipe out everyone's the patient's bone marrow, and then reinsert the corrected, seed it with the corrected cells. But that's like a long, extended, many weeks in hospital, extremely traumatic and painful experience. It's only maybe if you're really young and healthy, it might make sense. But if you can do that, like, what is it, in vivo, where you're basically injecting somebody, that would be far better. But it remains to be seen, like, this has been a huge suck of capital. Like, the amount of money that's been spent and effectively lost on those kinds of treatments has been immense. I've actually noticed on the ASX that it seems like the winners have kind of been small molecules. Like Neuron was one, obviously. I guess Telix you have to talk about. That's like probably one of the biggest commercial successes recently. There haven't been these like cell therapy. There have been cell therapies listed on the ASX. They just don't seem to have been incredibly successful.
And I think one of the reasons for that is that a lot of the original cell therapies that went after solid tumors didn't address this issue that solid tumors kind of fight back against the T cells. Blood cancers don't do that, so they're effective there, but in solid tumors they're not. And then the second thing is that even if you do get to a successful product or you get it into a late stage clinical trial like some of the American counterparts that you're talking about, that process of removing the T cells, editing them, putting them back in, that 4 to 6 week thing, just the bare bones cost for the company to do that is often tens of thousands of US dollars. The COGS, a small molecule drug, when you're making it at a large scale, is like free, essentially. It costs very, very little at scale. But these cell therapies, they just scale in a much worse way because you have to do that process. It's almost like a service in a sense. You're just doing it over and over again. There's no economies of scale. The more you do, the harder it gets. I think this in vivo approach might eventually flip that on its head. And I think that's why a lot of people are interested in this space again and investing more money back into it.
I think it's always one to watch. I haven't found in a long time one of those companies that you want to invest in. And then you think about companies like Intellia that have basically got working treatments. They've been some of the worst performing stocks for many years now. But then you look at it, it's like it might be a $2 billion company losing $500 million a year, and the share price has fallen since then. And so if it's going to take them 3 to 4 years to get it to market, and you're going to lose $2 billion between now and then, and your market cap's less than $2 billion, that's not a recipe for success. And then the rollouts have been so difficult, painful. The centers, and then you have to recruit people. Yeah, it's been a tough space, but I also have no doubt that, one way or another in 10, 15, 20 years, these will all be successful and in the market. So I guess we're just in this painful investment period. I don't think it's easy for me, a stock market investor, to make money out of these situations, to be honest. That's my take.
I think you're probably right. I mean, a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about is in the really early stage. So these companies that are doing the innovations that I'm talking about are not public yet, a lot of them. A lot of them are even preclinical. And these technologies are only just getting validated now. But the huge thing that's changed is the delivery. So this in vivo method that I'm talking about, how do you get this gene editor into the T cells and only the T cells? Because if I put that gene editor in other cells in your body, I'm going to potentially harm you. And so that delivery angle, basically we had no answers to that post-COVID, now there are a couple of answers. They're not amazing answers. They need work, they need validation, but we have more tools in our toolbox that we can try out. And so a lot of these preclinical companies are starting to do that now, which is it goes to your point. I think these are a while away from from public markets, but these things are going to be, over the next 5 years, they will be in public markets. They'll be raising late stage growth rounds. They'll have clinical readouts in large human trials, and so those are things that I would watch if I was biotech investor.
I think the science and trying to figure out what's going to work and what will work for patients, and then the investment side can just be so different. I mean, to come back to Syntara, obviously it's my favorite thing at the moment, so I'm happy to talk about it. But they did a raise at they raised $15 million, and this is a company they could barely. We participated in their prior raises. They were difficult raises, they were not easy to get across. There's one of those ones where you visit the company and it's like red carpet, meet everybody, take as much time as you want, kind of thing. Where you're like, well, the company that many investors coming through. But yeah, because of that, they raised $15 million. It soaked up all the demand. I think it was just the usual Aussie funds that don't really understand or don't. I mean, their game is just to participate in a lot of raises and make money that way, which is good, adds liquidity. I'm not rubbishing those funds, but probably they're not there for the bigger opportunity, which is, can you build this into a multi-billion-dollar asset? And the data suggests that it is a multi-billion-dollar asset. So actually, the share price went down after the result, which is wild because you're like, who bought the stock going into it, and then would have sold it after it succeeded? And the answer is they did a raise. So all the holders, a lot of the holders, some of whom I know, were just like, okay, I got filled in the raise. I'm just going to sell my stock. I'll take the profits on what I've got, and then I'll get reset with this new stock issuance. And that created a bit of a heavy weight on the stock. There was a similar situation in Orthocell, which is a Perth company, so your hometown, where they did a raise at 60 cents. And the share price just flopped around for just above it, occasionally dipping below for a few weeks. And then eventually all that turnover from the raise had it just reached that point where everybody who wanted to sell and recycle and go against somewhere else was out. And then the stock has doubled since, in a few months. And so I think if I have to predict on what happens in Syntara, I think it'll be something similar, where we're in this churn period where everybody who got filled with $50 million of a $100 million Aussie biotech that doesn't really want to have, big exposure in a small Aussie biotech is just going to be slowly sell out. But this should be a $200, $300, $400 million company in the midterm. So that's 2, 3, 4x from here. So I find that and then you've got the other assets they could spin out or develop. I find those from an investment perspective far more interesting than, some of these big, huge CapEx programs where it's going to be several $billion to get to market. They're going to have to charge, at least $2 million a treatment, possibly up to $5 million. That's kind of been where some of these gene therapies have been priced. And then they have a huge fight with, it becomes a political issue. You have to fight with the insurers. They can usually make a case that you can spend $2 million curing somebody and save on lifetime costs, but that's an abstract argument. You're convincing people to pay up the money. Yeah, in the EU, it just didn't fly. There were gene therapies approved in the EU that are now no longer available because nobody was allowed to use it. No one would pay for it. So yeah, it's not easy. Is there anything else catching your eye in the investment world?
Well, I just wanted to make a quick comment on what you were talking about. So you're right. A lot of those gene therapies that are specific to a specific, specific to a type of mutation in a rare or what they call an orphan disease, where globally there might be less than 10,000 people. The reason those prices for those drugs are so high is the amount of money you have to spend on validating it in clinical trials stays kind of the same, but the amount of patients that you can treat at the end are way smaller. To justify all the trial spend that they had to make any money at all, they have to charge a ridiculous price, which obviously a lot of people don't like. The good thing about these autoimmune indications, where now the same technology or similar technology is being applied to, these markets are way bigger. So millions of people have lupus worldwide, hundreds and hundreds of thousands have it in the US alone, and so they don't have to charge these ridiculous prices. And in fact, if they did, they probably wouldn't sell at all because lupus patients have other treatment options available that are the highest, maybe like $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year. So I think one of the reasons why this in vivo trend is interesting is because now we're using the technology that we validated or looked at initially in rare orphan genetic diseases. We're applying them to really huge markets now. Autoimmune disease is one of the largest markets there is. Hopefully we see that trend change as well. But you're right. I mean, it's a tough game. What else has taken my interest at the moment? I mean, I think you showed me an interesting paper on the last universal common ancestor. Do you want to chat about that? It was more chemistry and really fundamental biochemistry, so I thought it was really interesting, right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, it's almost it's not really investment related, but you can basically age like a genome because there's a rate of mutation that happens, and obviously as people know, evolution is kind of like a tree that branches off. So you can see which parts are conserved across everything, whether you're like a bacteria, like on a sulfur vent that doesn't even use, oxygen, or does the way we would, or, a worm or us, or, a fish or a shark. You can see parts that are conserved, and the parts that are the same almost certainly were there at the common ancestor, because they're extremely complicated cellular machinery. It's almost hard to believe. It's very hard to understand how this stuff even evolved in the first place. Data is what was like the minimum machinery that everything has. Whether you're like an anaerobic bacteria in the mountain, not in the mountain, like underground, or at the bottom of the ocean in a sulfur. Which parts of that are the same as us? Because then those parts are probably being conserved from a common ancestor. And then of those parts that are conserved, how many little mutations are there? Because we roughly know the mutation rate. So you can also age things or determine the age of things that way. And the result they came up to was about the age of the planet was the most recent last common universal ancestor. So what does that mean? That means that either all that complex machinery to have a cell kind of basically formed almost instantly, or it actually kind of might imply that it was seeded from somewhere else. And there's been other calculations, and the universe is, I think, 12, 13 billion years old. There's other calculations that suggest to actually get that last universal common ancestor, to get that complex machinery, it's more like 8, 9, 10 billion years of evolution, which would predate the Earth substantially. In which case, maybe it was seeded by meteorites, and there's nothing scientific that says that's not possible. That could very well have happened. I mean, we could shoot rocks at other, we could seed solar systems all around the universe. We could shoot a rock at a solar system, another part of the universe, and in a few billion years' time, maybe that would evolve life. You'd have all this advanced machinery that's developed over the last 4 billion years. We could do that today. So it does make you wonder, and I thought it was really interesting. I mean, do you have a take on that? Have you ever come across these ideas?
They found that this Luca, this last universal common ancestor, came right around the formation of the Earth, as soon as it was for there to be bacteria and all these kind of unicellular, multicellular prokaryotes on. In my head, I go a little bit the other way. I'm like, when we get to Mars, it's highly likely that we're going to find some kind of weird bug like this that is a universal common ancestor like microbe that's just naturally formed. And I think in the paper they had a really interesting thing in that this this organism, whatever it was, actually had an initial version of an immune system, a lot like the ones that bacteria today do. And it kind of just like agglomerated these different features. It was like a little blob, and then it went, oh, that, metabolism function, kind of, get that into me. This like immune system Cas9 thing that, modern bacteria have, oh, that looks kind of useful, and get that in there. And it's just kind of slowly accreted these different cellular functions, and then now all cells in everything has all of these functions, which is really, really fascinating. And I have a hunch that if we go to Mars and we look around in the frozen icy bits, we're going to find a lot of these.
It'll be fascinating to see if it's well. The other thing is, it's only happened once. There's only one Luca. It's not like there's two branches that formed at the same time. So if let's say at the beginning of the Earth there was a perfect environment to form a basic cell, and all of a sudden it's fully baked with like an immune system. It's fully baked with like antiviral mechanisms. So it's clearly been like waging war with viruses for a long time. If that was the case, then why aren't there other like branches that formed off there with completely parallel parts of life? That's what you'd assume, right? If that was the case, unless this was just so effective that just dominated everything else. There's so many different niches that generally doesn't happen. Usually things just adapt and evolve, and there's like convergent evolution. So things would look the same, but when you looked under the hood into the genome, then they should be completely different if it all formed at the same time as the Earth. If, however, there was just one like rock that seeded it all, then that would explain it. So I'm kind of like leaning towards that.
You're on the seeded asteroid theory. I like it.
Remember, there actually are rocks. Like often meteorites, there's been impacts that have been so big that it shot rocks out into the solar system, and those have definitely landed all over. There's rocks from Mars on the Earth, so there is a bit of flow that could be genetic flow as well between planets already that we know about. So it's interesting.
I mean, as a sci-fi fan, I've read a lot of books that start off like that. So
obviously, Elon Musk is trying to move everybody to Mars, and it looks like he might actually succeed in his lifetime. Maybe. What are the ethics around seeding other planets with life? I'm not sure.
It's an exciting concept. I mean, we'd have to pick the right planets. That might be a tricky bit, but I do like the idea. his whole reason to go to Mars is like to make life multiplanetary. Maybe a way more effective approach is just to put little vials of these microbes in a rocket ship and just shoot them out into space in
Yeah,
like
it wouldn't be that expensive.
shotgun.
But then maybe you'd be imagine if somebody did that to us, some alien species shoots some like vial, just hoping to seed the universe with life, and it ends up out competing us. To be honest, it's pretty unlikely. Like we're probably well evolved for our own planet. But it's like when I don't know, rabbits came to Australia and foxes, they were just more advanced. They just out competed all the little marsupials and things. Hmm, not sure.
Awesome. All right. Well, I feel like we covered a lot of topics there. We went from markets, we talked about politics a little bit, we talked about the Australian government, and then we wrapped it up with a bit of interesting science and potentially a bit of sci-fi in that. So I feel like we got a full gamut.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's wrap up there. Thanks.